Hi there, I'm Lena Anani, and you're listening to She Wrote a Book, where I interview amazing women from all over the world who also happen to be published authors. I created this show to educate, entertain, and inspire you to be the voice you want to hear in the world. Now let's get started. You are listening to episode number 95 of She Wrote a Book, and today I'm interviewing Sarah Barbour, author of the book Edit Me: How to Find, Hire, and Work with an Editor. In this concise guide, Sarah Barbour shares her experience as a freelance editor and a self-publishing author to show you how to work with an editor, who to hire, where to find them, what to look for, and how much to pay. Sarah Barbour is an editor and book coach who has worked with dozens of authors to help them craft books they can brag about. She is particularly passionate about helping entrepreneurs turn their expertise into books that will grow their businesses. Again, her book is called Edit Me: How to Find, Hire, and Work with an Editor. You can find the link to purchase her book in our show notes for this episode at SheWroteABook.com/95. Sarah, it's such a pleasure to have you here as a guest today. And my first question for you is this: why did you decide to write and publish this book?
Very good question. Well, I've been a freelance editor for about 4 years now, and I've worked with a lot of authors, and I absolutely love doing it. It's a lot of fun. But I get involved in all sorts of conversations in real life and online about the role that editors are supposed to play. And especially when you're a self-publishing author, you have to make the decisions about who you're going to hire to be on your book publishing team. So you have to make decisions about the cover designer and the formatter and your editor or editors if you decide to work with more than one. And there's often a lot of confusion because there are thousands of people offering editing services in dozens of different places, as well as on their own websites. And people often define the same services using different terms. There's a lot of confusion over the difference between, for instance, a copy editor and a line editor. And some people hire a developmental editor whose job really is to look at the overall story and structure of your book, but then they're disappointed if that person leaves them with bad grammar and bad punctuation, not understanding that that's not really their job to fix the grammar and the punctuation aspects of the book. So I wanted to write a book that would be a resource for self-publishing authors that would clearly explain what the different types of editing services are and what to expect from each one, give them a general idea of how much they should expect to pay. There's a huge, huge range. You're always going to be able to find people who are charging less or charging more than what I suggest, but at least gives you a sort of starting point so that you're not totally at sea and wondering what a fair price is. And it gives people some warning signs, things that you might want to keep an eye out for, because there are a lot of people who say they're editors who may not necessarily have a whole lot of experience, and I don't want people to get ripped off.
That's awesome. That's very cool. I'm really excited to read your book, actually.
Thank you.
I purchased my copy. I know it's on pre-order right now, but by the time the listeners hear this episode, it will definitely be available for sale and ready to read. You mentioned there's a difference between a copy editor and a line editor, and for the benefit of the listener, because I know they're like, oh my God, what is that? What is that? I mean, okay. Why are there so many different kinds of editors? So it would be great for you. It would be great for the listener for you to elaborate a little bit on those two.
Okay. Well, in the book, I break down editing services into 3 basic steps. I start with developmental editing, and sometimes that's called structural editing or substantive editing or content editing. And they all kind of refer to looking at the book as an overall piece of work. So that it's looking at the structure. Do you have a solid, consistent narrative? If you're in fiction, do your characters develop over time? Do you have any hanging plot threads that haven't been resolved? Is your tone consistent throughout the book? Are you developing the mood that you want? Do you have information in there that you don't need? Do you have all the information that you do need? So that's the developmental editor's job, is to look at the overall narrative. And then the next step is copy editing, which I've kind of conflated with line editing. And if you're truly traditional, line editing would be kind of the paragraph level editing. People are the editors are going to fix the sentences, make them graceful, make them work together at a paragraph level. Copy editing is more kind of getting into the grammar and the individual sentences as opposed to making the paragraphs flow together well. And in traditional publishing, those are two separate steps. But most self-publishing authors, it's a single step. It's people offer one or both, but for most of the time, you probably just need one or the other. And finally, there's proofreading, which is basically cleaning up at the very end and making sure there are no extra spaces, that the commas are where they're supposed to be, that there aren't any extra lines, that the spelling is correct. And some proofreaders will go in and fix the grammar, but they're really after just those tiny little nitpicky typos. And I also included a fourth category of beta readers. And beta readers aren't really traditional editors. They aren't used in the traditional publishing world. But these days, a lot of authors use them, and a lot of editors offer a beta reading service, which is basically reading books at the and just giving a kind of gut level assessment of them. And a lot of successful authors have fans who will do that for them. They'll just give them a copy of the book before it's published and say, let me know what you think. And even authors who haven't gotten a fan base yet might send them out to friends, to family, or even hire a professional editor who isn't going to give it the same detailed attention that a developmental editor would. But for $100 or $200, they might say, look, here's a really short report on the strengths and weaknesses of the book. Here's some things that could be improved. Now go improve them on your own. So those are the really basic categories. And like I said, in the traditional publishing world, you would go through every single one of these steps. And in the self-publishing world, that becomes a little more complicated and a little more expensive because you have to pay for it all yourself. But it's important to be aware of the differences so that you can pay for what you really feel you need and make the most of your budget.
Sarah, where was this book when I needed you? One of the, I'm a book coach too, and I always talk about editing. It's a big topic that doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. Right. And I talk about how with my first book, I spent $850 on editing. Mm-hmm. And on my second book, I spent $150 on editing. And then over time, you learn who to work with, you learn what you need and how to fit it into your budget. And I remember thinking wow, this is a really expensive lesson for me to learn. I really didn't need to spend that much money on an editor. And I write nonfiction. So I feel like with nonfiction, the key is to make sure your message is clear and make sure you clean up your grammar, your spelling mistakes, and your punctuation. So I always recommend, if you're on a budget, hire a proofreader instead of a full-blown editor. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it really depends. I think if you're on a serious budget, your best bet is to probably get some beta readers in the mix. Try to find some people who are willing to give you honest feedback, so not people who are maybe like your mom who doesn't want to hurt your feelings or your best friend, but look for people who are in the target audience that you want to reach, who can say, yes, this really gave me the information I needed, or it touched me, or it moved me. So, I mentioned in the book, if you're giving your romance novel to people who only read personal development books, they're not going to be able to give you good feedback. You really want to get the book into the hands of people who like romance novels and understand how they're supposed to work. So I would say go with a beta reader, either a cheap professional or get some people in your target market who are willing to do it on a volunteer basis. And take their feedback seriously. You don't necessarily have to incorporate all of it, but really try to be objective about the information that you get back. And then I think a proofreader is always a really, really good idea, especially because I think people, when reviewers find out that a book is self-published, they do tend to get pickier, I think, than they are with traditionally published books. Because I've seen traditionally published books that had typos and all sorts of nonsense in them. But when people hear self-published, they automatically assume that it's not going to be as high quality. So they do kind of go out of their way to look for errors. And it's annoying, but it happens, and so it's wise, I think, to give people as few chances as possible to give you bad feedback.
Awesome. So I have another question for you. When it comes to editing, there's the two categories. There's fiction and nonfiction. How do you approach? What's your editing approach for fiction versus nonfiction?
Well, I do more developmental editing for nonfiction. I've done a lot of copy editing for fiction, and they're pretty different animals. With fiction especially, you want to look for an editor who's going to really respect, well, in any, fiction or nonfiction, you want an editor who's really going to respect your voice, especially at the copy editing level, because a proofreader won't go in and change your sentences around. But you don't want an editor who's going to be, if he's got a story that's being told from the perspective of a high school dropout who grew up in a bad neighborhood, then the grammar shouldn't be perfect. You don't want somebody who's going in there and making it sound like this person just graduated from Harvard. You want somebody who's going to respect the voices of your characters, who's going to respect your voice as a writer and your style. And sometimes that means correcting the grammar. Sometimes it means not correcting the grammar. It really depends on the mood that you're trying to set. And so throughout the book, I keep saying you've got to get a sample from people. You've got to see what they're going to do to your work before you hire them, so that you don't get a situation where somebody is trying to turn your science fiction book into an academic treatise. You don't want that language. You want it to be in your own style. You want to look for somebody who really respects that.
Absolutely. Well said. I'm smiling over here because I agree with everything you've just said. I love it. So Sarah, what do you love most about being an author?
About being an author or an editor?
An author,
the
actually.
Author
yeah.
Of the book. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've written a couple of different books. I've written 2 nonfiction books and 2 fiction books, and both kinds are fun. They're totally different. I like writing fiction because it's just creative and fun, and it's not too serious. I write romance novels, so it's just it's nice to kind of get out of trying to convey information and just enjoy it and have fun and create characters, create a world. With nonfiction, my goal is to give people information that they can then use to carry on and do useful things with their own work. And so it's rewarding. It's a little nerve-wracking because I'm always sort of like, well, what if they don't need this, or what if they have a different opinion? But it's so far the reactions, the feedback that's out in the book has been pretty positive. I think that people do find it useful to have somebody kind of lay this information out in a clear step-by-step way that cuts through a lot of the noise that's out there. So that's really gratifying.
Fantastic. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for being our special guest today. We will have a link to your book in the show notes for this episode, and our listeners can find that at SheWroteABook.com/95 to learn more about our author and her wonderful book. Thanks again, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to She Wrote a Book. If you enjoyed this episode, then subscribe now so you can automatically get access to all new episodes, and feel free to share your inspired thoughts with us in the comments too. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, may you always feel good and make magic.